Welcome back to yet another teaching module in economics. We have just begun with the topic market equilibrium, and in this video I will take you further in this topic. In the previous lesson we learned how prices are determined in the market under perfect competition. We learned the determination of equilibrium price under perfect competition. And having learned that, I need to take you further to help you to understand how and why prices change in the market. With the knowledge that you will acquire in this module, you will be able to apply to any situation in real life. So let me take you on then. We will learn about changes in equilibrium price due to change in demand, supply remaining constant. Secondly, we will learn about the changes in equilibrium price due to change in supply, demand remaining constant. Thirdly, we will learn about changes in equilibrium price due to changes in both demand and supply in the same proportion. Before I begin to teach you the effect on the equilibrium price due to changes in demand only, supply remaining constant, I need to refresh your mind about the changes in demand that take place due to change in other factors other than price. We know that there are two cases of shifts in demand or the changes in demand that take place due to change in other factors other than price. The first being increase in demand. When does an increase in demand take place, or when do we have a forward shift in demand taking place? Well, demand can increase due to change in tastes and preferences in favor of a good. So if you like a particular good or you take a liking to a particular good, then you may want to increase your demand for that good at the same price. Secondly, demand can shift forward or increase when there is a rise in income. So we are able to spend more. Demand can also increase if there is a rise in the price of related goods. So if the price of the related good rises, consumers are attracted to consume more of this good that we are talking about. And so they may increase their demand for this good. Also, if there are expectations that the price of this particular good may rise in the future, they will demand more in the present. So these are the reasons why demand may shift forward. Let us now move on to study or revise the second case, that is decrease in demand. The second case of shifts in demand or changes in demand due to factors other than price changing is decrease in demand. Demand can decrease due to a decrease in income. It can decrease due to change in tastes and preferences against this good. So you may suddenly, just develop a dislike for this good, or maybe you may just decide to quit consuming this good to the extent that you were doing earlier, and so you would decrease your demand at the same price if your tastes and preferences change. Demand could also decrease if there is an expectation that the price of this particular good is expected to fall in the future. So you will demand less now and you will postpone your demand for when the price falls. Demand can also decrease if there is a fall in the price of the related good, because then consumers will shift their demand to the related good because the price of the related good has fallen. Having revised the shifts in demand, you are now in a better position to study how equilibrium price changes when demand shifts forward and when demand shifts backward. So you will understand whether and how the equilibrium price changes. Let's now study the change in equilibrium price due to change in demand, supply being constant. In this case as well, we will study it in two cases. One is case 1, when demand increases, supply being constant. So therefore case 2 will be when demand decreases, supply being constant. Let's take the first case scenario. Consider that demand increases, perhaps due to the factors that we just revised, change in tastes and preferences in favor of this good, rise in income, expectations that the price is going to rise even further in the future, and if the price of the related good has increased, and so on. Let's see what happens when demand increases. The demand curve will definitely shift forward to a new demand curve, that is D1, D1. This new demand curve D1, D1 intersects the original supply curve SS at a new equilibrium point E1. And this new equilibrium point E1 determines a new equilibrium price which will be higher, that is OP1, and a new equilibrium quantity, that is OQ1. So you see what happens when demand increases, supply being constant? Not only there is a rise in the equilibrium price from OP to OP1, but there is a rise in the equilibrium quantity demanded and supplied from OQ to OQ1. Let us now study case 2, that is the change in the equilibrium due to a decrease in demand, supply being constant. Demand can decrease due to a fall in income, or tastes and preferences may change against this good, or perhaps the price of the related good may have fallen, so consumers will shift to the related good. Perhaps there is an expectation that the prices of this particular good may fall in the future, so the consumers may decrease their demand in the present situation. So for all these reasons, the demand curve may shift backwards. Let's see how it impacts the equilibrium price. Can you see what has happened? The equilibrium price has shifted from OP to OP2. The equilibrium price has fallen from OP to OP2 because the equilibrium point has shifted from E to E2. This new equilibrium point E2 determines a new equilibrium quantity demanded and supplied, which is a lesser quantity demanded and supplied. So you can see that when supply remains constant and demand decreases, not only the price falls, but the quantity demanded and supplied also falls. So that is the impact that a decrease in demand has on equilibrium price when supply remains constant. Before we begin the second part, that is, we are trying to study the changes in equilibrium price due to changes in supply demand remaining constant, I think it is right for us to refresh our minds about the shifts in supply. So we have the increase in supply, which is a forward shift in supply, and that can come about when the price of related goods rises. So if the related goods price rises, then the supply of this good will increase. If taxes are reduced and if subsidies are increased, then supply of this good will increase. If the cost of the production, factors of production falls, then supply will shift forward because the supplier is in a position to supply more at the same price. If there is a high business confidence, the supplier is ready to supply more or increase their supply. Say, for example, the technique of production improves. The supplier is able to supply more at the existing price, and for all these reasons, the supply curve shifts forward. Let's now revise the second shift in supply, that is, decrease in supply. We know supply decreases if price of related goods falls. So the supplier is very confident that the consumers will shift their demand to his good. So he is not ready to supply more at the same price. He will supply less at the same price. Supply can also decrease if taxes are increased, so it becomes expensive. And also if subsidies are reduced. So the cost of production will rise for the supplier, and so he supplies less at the same price. Cost of factors of production rises, that will also bring about a fall or decrease in supply. If there is low business confidence, then supply will be decreased at the same price the supplier decreases his supply. So these are the reasons why supply may decrease. We need this knowledge to help us to understand What will happen to equilibrium price if supply changes, demand remaining constant? Having revised the shifts in supply, that is the increase and decrease in supply, we are now in a better position to understand what happens when supply increases or decreases, demand being constant, to the equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. We can see here in the diagram, DD is the demand curve, SS is the supply curve, both intersect at a point E. The price determined at this point is OP and the quantity demanded and supplied is OQ. Now we will venture out to study case 1, that is when supply increases, demand being constant, what happens to equilibrium? As you can see, the supply curve has shifted forward. There is a new supply curve S1, S1, and this new supply curve S1, S1 intersects the original demand curve at a new equilibrium point E1. The price determined by this point is OP1 and the quantity determined at this point is OQ1, which is a higher quantity demanded and supplied. And the price falls from OP to OP1. So you see, when supply increases, demand being constant, the equilibrium price falls and the equilibrium quantity demanded and supply increases. Let us now see what happens when supply decreases, demand being constant. As you can see here, we're going to study case 2, that is supply decreasing, demand being constant. Here again, DD is the demand curve, SS is the supply curve, both intersect at a point E. OP is the price that is determined and OQ is the quantity demanded and supplied. Let us see what happens when supply decreases. Obviously, the supply curve shifts backward. We have a new supply curve, that is S2, S2, and this new supply curve S2, S2 intersects the original demand curve DD at a new equilibrium point E2. There is a higher price determined, that is OP2, and there is a lesser quantity demanded and supplied, equilibrium quantity demanded and supplied, that is OQ2. So you see, when supply decreases, demand being constant, the equilibrium price rises from OP to OP2 and the equilibrium quantity demanded and supplied falls from OQ to OQ2. We are now moving to the third part, that is, we are trying to study what will happen to equilibrium when both demand and supply change in the same proportion. There will be many instances in real life when demand and supply respond. And so let us see what impact it has on equilibrium. So we study the case 1, that is supply increasing, demand increasing, both in the same proportion. We know that when supply and demand increase, they will both shift forward. So let us look at what happens when the demand and supply curve shift forward. Did you notice what happened? Did the price change? The equilibrium price has not changed. It has remained the same because demand and supply have shifted or increased in the same proportion. However, there is a change in the equilibrium point from E to E1. As you can see, the demand has shifted from D to D1, D1. Supply as well has shifted forward from SS to S1, S1. These new curves, that is D1, D1 and S1, S1, have intersected at a new point. But the price has not changed. It remains the same. However, there is something that has changed, and that is the equilibrium quantity demanded and supplied. It has changed from OQ to OQ1. So you see, when both demand and supply increase together in the same proportion, the equilibrium price remains unchanged. However, the equilibrium quantity increases. Now let us study case 2, and that will be studying the change in the equilibrium price or quantity demanded and supplied when both demand and supply decrease in the same proportion. So the case 2 is supply decreasing, demand decreasing in the same proportion. What do you think will happen? Let's see. Oh, look, the supply and demand curve has shifted backward. The equilibrium point has also shifted from E to E2. The demand curve has shifted backward from DD to D2D2. Supply curve has also shifted from SS to S2S2. And that has brought about a new equilibrium point, E2. However, it is noted here again that the price has not changed. However, the equilibrium quantity has changed. The equilibrium quantity demanded and supplied has fallen from OQ to OQ2. So you see, when demand and supply decrease together in the same proportion, the price, equilibrium price, remains unchanged. However, the equilibrium quantity demanded and supplied will fall. So now you know what happens to equilibrium price when demand changes, supply being constant, supply changes, demand being constant, both demand and supply change in the same proportion. Let us now sum it up. Today we have learned about changes in equilibrium price due to change in demand, supply being constant, changes in equilibrium price due to change in supply, demand remaining constant, and we studied the change in equilibrium due to change in both demand and supply. Having learned the impact of a change in demand, supply being constant, the change in supply, demand remaining constant, or both demand and supply changing in the same proportion, you can now take different situations and apply the knowledge that you have learned today. You now know how and why prices change in the market, how the price mechanism works. These concepts can be applied to various situations from real life. In fact, you can use these concepts or learned matter to even predict the behavior of prices in response to a change in demand and supply. For example, if I tell you that right now in the present situation, there is going to be an increase in the demand for masks and sanitizers, what will be the response of price and quantity demanded and supplied? In response, in the present situation, the supply being constant. So you will go in for the shifting of the demand curve forward, and when the demand curve shifts forward because of an increase in demand, immediately the market mechanism will start working and there will be a response. You will notice, if you draw the diagram quickly, you will see that the price rises and the quantity demanded and supplied also will respond to this rise in price, supply being constant. So you see, you can adapt and apply these learned concepts to any situation from real life and even predict economic behavior. Thank you, children, for giving me a listening ear. I would urge you to read, revise, and review to make sure you have committed it to your memory for good. All these diagrams, all the 6 diagrams that we have learned today, you can't look at them and study them. You have to draw them down on your book and practice them several times, maybe roughly. But you have to draw and practice. And as you draw, you will understand better, and at the exam you will be able to reproduce the diagram exactly the way it needs to be.